Hi, good morning, everyone. Really nice to be with you this morning. So yeah, thanks for joining. This is our introduction to digital monitoring for maths. We're going to be talking today about how digital monitoring works, how it can help spot students that are at risk online, with risks that may otherwise go unnoticed. So I'm joined today by Matt Potts, who's our Multi-Academy Trust Specialist. Matt, nice to be with you.
Morning, everyone. Thank you, Rob.
And my name is Rob Holmer. I'm Director of Safeguarding Products here at Smoothwall. So yeah, just a little bit of housekeeping before we dive in. We're recording the Zoom, so if you have to drop out for whatever reason, we'll be sharing it afterwards, so don't worry about that if you want to share it with your colleagues. We've also got the Q&A, so we've had some questions in advance of the webinar, which we'll go through, but also feel free to use the Q&A, which you should see in the Zoom controls. Pop any questions you've got in there, and then we'll answer those at the end. Yeah, any questions, comments, anything at all that we can help with, just stick those in there. Okay, so just looking at our agenda for this webinar. As I said, we're going to talk about digital monitoring, what it is and how does it work specifically in a math environment. We're going to talk about how it can spot students that are at serious risk, how to deploy that in a math environment, how it can benefit your DSLs, your SLT and your IT teams. And then, as I said, we'll get on to any questions that you might have. So I'm going to hand over to Matt, who's going to lead you through the first section.
Perfect. Thank you, Rob. So yeah, initially just going to talk around what digital monitoring is, then we're going to look at how it actually works, and try and differentiate between web filtering, because I understand certain web filters will have safeguarding alerts built into them. So differentiate between web filtering and what actually what proactive monitoring can do to complement that. So initially, digital monitoring identifies students at risk based on what they do, say, or share in their digital lives, which teachers and parents often don't see, and which therefore often go unnoticed. So slightly later on in this presentation, we're going to look at the iceberg effect, which highlights physical behaviours. So what staff can see in the classroom. Obviously, they can only see certain things. Students will modify their behaviour to not be detected while they're using school equipment, school laptops, Chromebooks, whatever it may be. So physical behaviours is only part of it, really. We need to look at their digital behaviours as well, and that's exactly what digital monitoring is trying to identify, how your students are behaving and interacting online. Digital monitoring solutions, safeguarding software is effectively a virtual assistant that enables DSLs to spot more at-risk students than they would using eyes and ears alone, because obviously in the classroom you've got 30 devices. You might have students who are taking laptops home, so having some kind of monitoring software on there that is able to capture everything that's being typed on those devices, and obviously alerting your safeguarding team immediately to any concerning behaviours being exhibited. So yeah, that's digital monitoring.
I think that, some DSLs often say to me, is this intended to replace the role of a DSL? And I think that, a really important part of this is that actually this is something that enables DSLs to be more effective, because it takes away, them having to manually review online activity, web filter logs, by telling them what we found, what are the most important things. So actually it makes them more effective, and really there's no substitute for the expertise that a DSL has to be able to understand what's going on in a student's life, to be able to talk to them, interact with them, and this actually gives them more time to do that, because they're receiving targeted information from the system that says, look, there is an issue to do with this and this student. We suggest that you have a look at that, but that the DSLs are the experts here, so we're not here to take that role away from them.
And on that point as well, Rob, I know in a lot of schools and trusts that we work with who don't necessarily have dedicated monitoring software in place, the safeguarding leads will actually rely on IT to share reports with them. So they will request reports from IT, and IT a lot of the time are the ones who actually have to audit and review those alerts, remove any false positives on behalf of the safeguarding team. And ultimately, that isn't your responsibility. A lot of IT managers aren't necessarily safeguarding trained. You don't necessarily know what you should be looking out for. So monitoring software is kind of tends to fall under the remit of your safeguarding teams. And it gives you that clear distinction between what IT are expected to do and what your safeguarding leads are expected to do, and it empowers your safeguarding leads to do their jobs more effectively instead of relying on the IT managers, the technicians, to share that information with them, because I guess that leads to a more reactive process instead of being more proactive with the way that you're able to identify these issues. So yeah, are you okay to move on to the next slide for me, please, Rob? So this just goes through digital monitoring and how it actually works. So we would roll out a monitoring client onto a device. So that could be an MSI file pushed out by a group policy. If you've got Chromebooks, it would be a Chrome extension. And once that client software is on that school device, it will then start to capture all keystrokes, risk words, risk behaviors that are being exhibited on that device, which, yeah, Rob, can you move on for me? So those risk words are captured, those behaviors are triggered, and then that would be fed through to our AI platform. The AI would then assess those risk words, remove the more basic false positives, so potentially words like assessment, Scunthorpe, Middlesex, that we know aren't genuine risks, and we, or the AI platform, can delete those on your behalf. Then once you confirm that they are high risk, that would then be sent through to a team of human moderators, whereas the low risk alerts would just be fed through to the digital monitoring dashboard. So the low risk alerts wouldn't necessarily be moderated, but they might become more relevant further down the line, should a more serious safeguarding incident come to light, whereas the high risk incidents will be moderated. So you'll have a team of human moderators who will audit and review those alerts. We can then notify the DSL immediately. The forms of contact that we make will differ slightly depending on the severity of that incident. If there's an immediate threat to life, we can actually call the DSLs, because there's certain instances whereby we don't just want to assume you're looking at your inbox or you're on the actual dashboard itself. We want to proactively make you aware of what's going on. So yeah, we have the ability to actually call for those really threat to life incidents. And then the alternative is an email notification that can be shared as well, regardless of the risk level that's being assigned. So they're usually graded from a level 1 to a level 5. They will all be fed into the digital monitoring dashboard. There is actually integration as well between monitoring systems and also your record management software as well. So if you have either CPOMs, My Concern, or Safeguard, the risk alert and the events will automatically be fed through to those record management softwares as well. So from an Ofsted perspective, that highlights a really strong e-safety process, because not only are you able to highlight the risks, and not only are you demonstrating that you are proactively looking at these risk words and risk behaviors, you can then demonstrate how that information is directly being fed into your record management software, which is when you would then demonstrate the action being taken by the DSL. So whether it's a meeting with a parent, a communication with the student, but obviously shows a very strong and robust e-safety process. And ultimately, I'm going to talk about web filtering in the next slide, but web filtering and web filtering alerts will only see what's being typed on an internet browser. It won't see what's being typed in a Microsoft Word document or an Excel spreadsheet or in a social media forum or platform. So there's a lot of instances, there's a lot of events that would be missed by a web filter because they aren't keystroke logging. They aren't capturing everything that's being typed on a device, regardless of the application or the browser. One of the issues with more rudimentary monitoring systems is the fact that they tend to generate a huge number of false positives and a huge number of emails which are either sent through to the IT managers, which they then have to deal with. And obviously there's administrative burdens and overheads associated with that, or that will sit with the DSL, who again has to kind of trawl through those alerts and pick out an event that is deemed to be a genuine risk. And that's exactly what those human moderators on our side are trained to deal with. So they're the ones that are going to be removing false positives on your behalf and also proactively contacting you for any of those serious incidents. So, Rob, is there anything that you wanted to add to that?
Yeah, I just think that, in terms of the work that human moderation team are doing, it's not just looking at what's been typed in isolation, but it's looking at the context around that as well. So there's a screenshot of the activity at that time, and the moderation team can see the last couple of things that were typed before then. So a really classic false positive example might be that, the student's gone to Google and they've typed in cannabis. And you could look at that in isolation and say, well, that's of concern. They're obviously searching for drugs. But when you look at the context around that and see, for example, that, they are doing a piece of schoolwork around drug abuse and that this is just part of that research that they're doing, then it might still be logged as a low risk event because it might be something that you want to, have recorded in case something develops with that student at a later date. But it's certainly not going to be a high risk immediate event. So that human moderation can help contextualize these things that on their own might seem significant, but when you look at the bigger picture of what that student's doing, it becomes less important.
Thank you, Rob. Do you want to skip on to the next slide? So yeah, just trying to distinguish between web filtering and digital monitoring. I know this can cause a little bit of confusion in terms of what monitoring actually means. So web filtering is much more preventative, right? So you are trying to prevent your students and staff from being able to access inappropriate material online. So you're trying to effectively shield your students from the world a little bit, or from the online world. So that's where the web filtering comes into place, the content filtering side of things. You want to ensure that your students obviously have access to educational resource while also exposing them to illicit material. So from a KICSI perspective, from an Ofsted perspective, you must have obviously web filtering in place. But that's only part of the puzzle, I suppose, from a safeguarding perspective, because Ofsted expects schools to be more proactive in the way that they identify these risks, these trends. And that's where digital monitoring comes in. So those proactive alerts that are being generated allow you to see what your students, or any concerning behaviors that your students are exhibiting. It gives you that information. It allows you to identify these risks as well before they escalate into something more serious. So instead of reacting to a situation, you can actually kind of intercept it, if you like, and you can intervene at an earlier stage before they escalate. So web filtering is much more preventative. Like I say, it would normally sit with IT to manage those allow and block lists, whereas digital monitoring should really fall under the remit of safeguarding, given that they are the ones who should be identifying these risks, the ones that are kind of familiar with certain acronyms or slang phrases or whatever it may be that the students are using, those kind of risk behaviors. That is what digital monitoring is there to spot and identify. So yeah, there needs to be a clear distinction between IT and safeguarding in that respect. Digital monitoring really should sit with the e-safety teams and safeguarding teams at your school. So yeah, that's how monitoring differs from filtering.
Yeah, I mean, I guess, you could argue that, well, it's really easy to keep children safe online with filtering because you just block all the bad websites. In fact, you say only allow them onto, I don't know, like the BBC website and Wikipedia. But the whole point of giving students internet access is not to just allow them access to a list of websites are safe. It's there to allow them to learn critical thinking, research skills, to learn how to be good online digital citizens. And clearly that's what Ofsted and inspectors are looking for is, are you using technology in a way that enables them to learn and to be online safely and learn how to go into the adult world as responsible users of the internet. So that's really where monitoring comes in, that web filtering, yes, it's got a role to play by blocking the nasty stuff, but actually monitoring is all about allowing them onto a wide range of different online resources, but safe in the knowledge that their interactions are not going to get them into trouble, that they're not introducing any risks by conversations that they might be having and things like that. So definitely a complementary set of technologies. You can't really have one without the other. You know, we have seen some schools that putting monitoring without web filtering, and the obvious happens. All the kids go searching for porn. And yes, you know, we report that, but you know, web filtering's got a role to play there by blocking the stuff that you know is inappropriate, but it works hand in hand with the monitoring to allow students, you know, safe and productive access to the internet.
Thank you, Rob. Yeah, are you okay to skip on to the next slide? I noticed as well that some people might have raised some questions, and we can obviously answer those towards the end of the presentation. It's quite interesting, actually, how legislation and guidelines has developed around monitoring over the last 2 or 3 years. I think in part as a result of COVID and the burden that that's had with mental health, the mental health implications with students. The number of devices that we now see going home, so the fact that it isn't purely on premise, and the fact that teachers or you're relying on teachers physically monitoring screens really isn't a viable solution anymore. And particularly the UK Safer Internet Centre guidelines have developed with that. KICSI still states that all schools should ensure they have appropriate levels of filtering and monitoring systems in place and regularly review their effectiveness. So if you feel like you are receiving too many alerts and you know there's an increased workload there and you're not able to adequately deal with those alerts and manage them effectively, then you should obviously be reviewing your processes internally. So again, the leadership team, governors and relevant staff should have awareness and understanding of the monitoring provisions in place, manage them effectively, and know how to escalate concerns when identified. And if we look at the UK Safer Internet Centre guidelines on the next slide, you can see that they've made 3 distinctions. So physical monitoring. So I think in my experience, the only type of environments where physical monitoring is viable is maybe certain special schools who don't really have any kind of independent use of technology, where it's all one-to-one learning. So in those types of environments, then physical monitoring is viable and it's something that you can manage effectively. If there is independent learning, if you do have students that are using their devices, school-owned devices, away from the classroom, then obviously active monitoring would be the next step. So that ensures that you're able to view everything that's being typed on those devices. So even if a student was to type something in and immediately delete it, monitoring software is still able to pick that up and obviously notify the relevant staff members around school or within your trust. Obviously, with active monitoring, there's no kind of third-party human moderation, so you are still likely to see false positives. And again, there's an administrative burden there that either sits with IT or your safeguarding leads. And then you've got the proactive monitoring side of things, which is keystroke logging. So again, you're able to see everything on that device that's being typed in. But then you do have that specialist third-party provider who supports with the intervention side of things, with the grading of the alerts, with the removal of false positives, but also just being that kind of extra eyes and ears around school that's able to identify these issues and obviously ensure that you're not missing anything, while also capturing everything. So yeah, those are the 3 main distinctions that the UK Safer Internet Centre have made. So again, these monitoring strategies, the appropriate monitoring strategy selected should be informed by your risk assessment and your circumstances. So I guess the amount of internal resource that you have, if you do have monitoring software in place, again, if there's a large number of false positives that are being generated, are you able to manage those effectively? That will probably allow you to make a decision between whether active monitoring is sufficient or whether you should look at more of a proactive monitoring solution. And probably that's dependent on the size of your schools as well. That will all play a part. So yeah, those are the UK Safer Internet Centre guidelines, which were updated about 12 months ago now. They did used to refer to it just being appropriate levels of monitoring, but that was quite open to interpretation. So they've gone into a little bit more depth now about what they mean by monitoring.
You know, I guess it's being able to justify to yourselves, your governors, your parents, your inspectors, that there are different ways of achieving the requirement to do monitoring, but can you honestly say that they are appropriate? You know, as Matt says, you know, for a small class, great, but if you've got 1 teacher, 30 kids, they can't physically monitor their online activities and what they're doing. It's just an impossibility. So maybe active monitoring is great, but then if you're saying, well, actually with active monitoring, we're getting thousands of alerts per day, so even though we're doing it, we're not reviewing the alerts, then again, it's not it's not appropriate, or it's not, being implemented in a way that achieves that monitoring aim. So then, that's why a lot of schools obviously look at proactive monitoring, where there is that human moderation side that happens on the vendor, so on our side, that reviews those and then sends you more focused, targeted alerts with different levels and different levels of severity associated with them. All right. So let's do just a quick poll. If you have a minute just to answer this question. So the poll is, and it should be popping up on your screen now. Of all the kind of online safety concerns that you have at the moment, is the one that perhaps stands out any more than another? Obviously, they're all important, but are there any of these that particularly are more concerning? And if you do choose the other option and you want to share that, feel free to stick that in the Q&A as well. We'll just let that run for a couple of seconds.
It's always interesting to see how these trends seem to develop through the year, and certain trends and certain kind of these safeguarding classifications can change at certain points in the year, at the start of term, at the end of term. And that's something that's reflected in the kind of Smooth All Monitor stats that we see, isn't it, Rob?
Yeah, and indeed, we've been running this exact same question for a year or two now in our webinars, and it's interesting to see how the responses change over time. I'm just going to end that poll now, and the results should pop up on your screen. So yeah, self-harm and suicide always tends to unfortunately be one of the major concerns, and obviously hand in hand with that goes mental health concerns. Bullying and violence. We all appreciate that. In certain online platforms, kids are talking a lot about bullying and sending online abuse to their peers. It's interesting that it's slightly lower on the online sexual abuse and grooming side than previously. I know that this was a huge concern during lockdowns, that there were people actively targeting children in a socially vulnerable state. They were at home, they weren't seeing their friends, they were looking for interaction, so they were getting themselves into situations where they were chatting with strangers online. Obviously still very much a risk, but really great to hear your feedback there on what you see as those risks. Great. Yeah, so looking at risks, really, we like to use this kind of iceberg analogy to talk about the sort of risks that happen in an online world and in a physical world, or in an offline world. So there are things that that the people on here that are DSLs will be very accustomed with, looking at as indicators that children are potentially in need of help. So things like changes in their behavior, they're coming to school with injuries and bruises, there's a marked difference in their academic performance that might be affected by something at home. Absenteeism, them coming to DSLs and other members of staff and asking for help. Known domestic risks, maybe there's a potential known concern with a sibling or a parent, or tip-offs from others. I've seen or I've heard this about this other student, and then the DSL can take that information and act on that. So these are things that DSLs are very used to deal with in a physical world. But there are a huge range of risks that exist in an online world, which are very difficult for a DSL to be able to see and identify without the help of a monitoring tool. So I'm not going to go through every single one of these, but online conversations are something that are a huge source of information about risks associated with students, whether that's online conversations they're having with strangers or with their colleagues and peers. And in those conversations, they might be talking about drug abuse, extremism, about self-harm or abuse, things like that. You've got a huge amount at the moment. This is a really bubbling sort of topic that some of you might not be aware about, but the incel movement and other kinds of far-right extremism, where you've got people talking about very extremist views around women and about relationships, and these can lead to some very serious situations. There's been a couple of the mass shootings in America that have come from this incel culture. So we're seeing a lot of that happening in schools with students online. You've got, obviously, we talked about bullying, violence, self-generated sexual content, where students are sharing pictures and things like that with third parties or with other students that they shouldn't be doing. You've got overly abusive language, which can be an indicator of some other underlying concern. You know, a student that's lashing out all the time, in the same way that a kid was lashing out in a classroom. It's probably not just that in isolation. There's probably something else going on in their personal life that's causing them to have this this kind of angry state of mind, you know. Matt touched before on feelings and emotions typed in a document. You know, we see a lot of this kind of Dear Diary type approach where a student might be outpouring their emotions, their feelings in written form, and they might then go on to not share that with anybody. But if they're using a school device that's monitored, then of course we'll see that, and we'll be able to offer them any help and support that they need. Child on child abuse was something that was very much brought about by the DfE and Ofsted last year, where it came about through a lot of sexual abuse situations that were being reported by children, and that as big a risk of sexual abuse from adults is a risk of sexual abuse from other children, and that schools should assume that this sort of thing is happening. You know, you can't just say, well, you know, not my kids, you know, these are all angels. Assume this kind of abuse is happening, whether that's, you know, through online behavior, you know, comments, you know, sharing of images, things like that, through to actual physical abuse. This is something that again, we see quite a lot of happening. You got things like searches. So, you know, what they're actually searching for online can be a big indicator. You know, most students use Google as their gateway to the internet. So if they're looking to harm themselves, they will probably go to Google and type in how to harm myself. So it's that kind of thing that a web filter might pick up as well. But with monitoring, you get that whole context around it. So perhaps they've gone on to Google and typed in, can you overdose from paracetamol? But we can see in the screenshot, they've got another tab open, which is a PowerPoint presentation where they're doing schoolwork on overdosing or drugs or something like that. So there's extra context that monitoring gives you because you see that screenshot, you see what else they've been doing. Whereas the web filter would just tell you, they've searched for this. That's all we know.
Again, I suppose the web filter would be there to prevent or limit some of these things happening. But in terms of identifying the risk and the behavior, so things like chat room conversations, harmful image sharing, students oversharing their personal information online, again, would not be picked up by the web filter alerts, but it would at least kind of prevent students from potentially accessing some of these websites in order to then interact with an external party or whoever it may be that might lead to a serious incident. So yeah, again, a good example of the two solutions working in unison and complementing one another.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, what are some of the myths about digital monitoring? And there are a lot of myths. So, you know, just to kind of talk about some of these. But again, if you've heard any of your own, then obviously feel free to stick those in the Q&A, and we'll talk about those. So, will I be bombarded with false positives? You know, it's something we've obviously talked about, where the whole point of a proactive monitoring system is that there is a team of human moderators. So here at Smoothall, we've got a team that are all based in the UK that review those alerts before they get passed through to the school. So that is really the main way in which false positives are avoided. So, you know, the situation where they've misspelled a word and it was clear that they didn't mean, you know, whatever the misspelling was, but, you know, it looked like another word that was a risk word. So, you know, the moderators can look at that and go, well, they've misspelled that word, but actually looking at the context, looking at the screenshot, you know, there's no risk there. But also looking at, as I mentioned, things like searches for drugs, where it's clear that it's part of schoolwork, or you know, other types of searches around, you know, self-harm, suicide. You know, older students will be doing work on more sensitive topics. You know, we work with a lot of FE colleges where students are studying safeguarding, so they're searching for child abuse and risks associated with that. So it's all about contextual analysis, which is what our moderators do. Does it replace the role of a DSL? Again, something I've already talked about. Clearly, that is not our intention at all. We very much value and appreciate the work that DSLs do, and we want to make sure they are as effective as possible by giving them the information they need and by freeing up their time that they might have had to be reviewing stuff that was false positives, by giving them the curated view of that information. Can it spy on children through the webcams? No, in a word. So, our software doesn't have the ability to just open the webcam and have a look. Now, what can happen is, if that student was in a video call and was typing and doing trigger words, then we may capture that screenshot. So that's all part of that context. So that screenshot may be captured if it contains relevant information. But if there was any nudity in there, obviously any sexual activity, anything that represented child sexual abuse materials, then we would immediately delete that screenshot. So we've got no intention of keeping any sensitive webcam information. We don't want anything to do with that. Is it breaching a child's right to privacy? This is obviously a really sensitive issue, and there's a balance here to be had, and it's all about proportionate responses. So we know that the government, DfE, through KICSI and the Safer Internet Centre, say that schools need to monitor students' activity on their devices. So there is also already a kind of mandate for this to happen, that is saying that schools obviously have a duty of care to that student to make sure they are safe, whether that's physically safe at school or safe online, particularly when they're using devices provided by the school to that student. So there's a balance between the child's right to privacy and the school's legal duty to safeguard them. So, it's something that every school should look at very carefully. Are they making a balanced, proportionate response to that? And the way in which we look at it is that we don't invasively monitor them 24/7. We don't monitor their GPS location. We don't know where they are. We don't monitor their webcam, as I spoke about. We have a set of measures in place which says that based on what they type, we will then respond to that and then potentially take screenshots and then raise that to the school. And we feel that that's a proportionate response to the need to keep them safe online. So clearly there will be a balance, and there will be questions that you need to ask yourselves, but this is true of any kind of technology, monitoring technology like CCTV, where you need to be assessing, is this appropriate? And yeah, the work done by KICSI and Safer Internet Centre have said pretty much that yes, this is appropriate, and it strikes a good balance between a child's right to privacy and the school's need to safeguard their well-being. I don't need monitoring. I've got web filtering. I think Matt's covered that. But yeah, they are very much complementary products. When you talk about safeguarding as a whole, it's a multi-layered approach that you need to take. It's a bit like physical security. On your house, you may have locks on the doors, locks on the windows, an alarm system, a dog, CCTV cameras. It's all about layering the measures that you take to ensure safety. So web filtering looks at one part of the puzzle. Monitoring looks at a different part of the puzzle. And obviously your DSLs and the work they do with the students and your classroom teachers and other members of staff, lunch supervisors, playground supervisors, they all form part of this overall multi-layered system of safeguarding. So, I'd never say that one thing alone can solve that problem. You've got to have those multiple layers to ensure that you're covering as many bases as possible. And finally, do you send the risk to the government? No. So we don't send anything to government or law enforcement. We are under data protection, a processor. So you are the controller, you own the data. We act on your instruction. So we do whatever you tell us to do with the data. If there was a situation where, we noticed a very serious concern, and, it wasn't being acted on, then perhaps we might get in touch with the head teacher at the school, if we saw something really serious. But ultimately, the schools own the data; they're responsible. In a MAT environment, typically we will have a lead DSL at the MAT level as well. So a lot of MATs will share that information and allow the lead DSL to see it, but we're not certainly sending it to MI5 or anything like that as part of what we do. Okay, so we've got another poll where we're going to talk about the operational concerns around monitoring. So we talked about what monitoring can do, how it operates, some of the risks it identifies, and some of the myths. But the operational side, say, yes, we go ahead, we take this product and we use it. What are your worries about that? And obviously, I don't think there's another option on this, but if you had any other concerns, again, feel free to stick them in the Q&A. Just give that another couple of seconds. Great, well, thanks for that. Let's have a look at the results there. So pretty even split, really. Limited budget, missing a child at risk, and lack of time and resource. I think that the lack of time and resource is something that we hear a lot. The most precious commodity to anybody that works in a school is time. So any way that we can save time is obviously a benefit. Any thoughts on those results, Matt?
I think, missing a child at risk as well, that's related to the amount of resource that you have internally as well. The amount of safeguarding leads that you think can keep on top of the alerts that are coming through. But obviously, if there's no safeguarding alerts, if there's no monitoring whatsoever, then you are severely constrained in terms of being able to identify a child at risk. So again, that kind of underpins the importance of monitoring. And I think that's why we've also seen a rise in the prevalence of these, a human moderated monitoring solution. We did once upon a time have a non-moderated solution, but it was just, people were asking us for that kind of moderation. They felt like they needed it because of their constraints from a resource perspective. So again, that kind of underpins the trends that we've been seeing over the last 2 or 3 years. The number of students that obviously safeguarding leads are trying to protect. Ultimately, that's something that you can't kind of manage on your own. And again, that's why those kind of monitoring solutions are so important. Again, limited budget, it's something that we see across the board. That's not just a monitoring issue. There's a number of different solutions that you might not be able to proceed with as a result of the budget. So I appreciate that. I guess one of the benefits of being a multi-academy trust is the fact that we do have aggregated pricing models, which means that you can achieve a much lower per license price as well. So if you're a standalone school, it's slightly different, but a multi-academy trust can definitely achieve economies of scale. So hopefully that helps from a budgetary point of view. But I think they're all very valid and relevant points in terms of concerns. So that's what I'd say on those points.
So so looking at some of the practicalities now of how you might implement a monitoring system, and split those by the responsibilities really of the DSL and IT. As we talked about earlier, I think it's really important to have that differentiation in terms of those responsibilities. The DSL, you've got central management there. So if you are the trust level DSL, being able to see all of your schools, intervene and help where necessary with those events at individual school level, but still giving them their own access so that they can see and respond to the alerts within their individual schools. I think that's really important from a MAT level because it allows schools to see the benefit of being as part of that MAT as well, because they get that safeguarding support from the MAT level. But it also, obviously empowers them to make their own decisions and act on those things, which would be, impractical from a central level. you've got the lower level of alerts that might come through just into the portal, but more frequently by email, where you might want to take a regular check on those. So we grade things on a level 1 to 5. A 5 being the most serious would certainly be an email, and for life-threatening situations would be a phone call as well. But depending on the category, and you can fine-tune this as well, maybe a 3, a 4, or a 5 might be an email. A 1 or a 2 would ordinarily not ever be looked at unless there was a specific situation with a child. So say there was a child that, there was a serious safeguarding incident, maybe there was a serious case review, maybe you would want to go back and look at those level 1s and 2s and say, were there any early warning signs that were missed? Were there things that, they were doing? Maybe they were doing some schoolwork on drugs, and the way that it was taught wasn't, done in a way that might have prevented them becoming an abuser of drugs or something like that. I don't know. But your level 1s and 2s generally you wouldn't look at, but your 3s and 4s, you probably want to have a regular check through your email and through the portal for those kind of things. But obviously you're going to be notified directly for high risk alerts. So immediate threats to life or well-being, you're going to get that phone call. So you've got that peace of mind that if something is really serious happening, you don't have to be checking your inbox all the time. And yeah, it gives time back versus a manually moderated system. So, you've got that time then to spend more time with students rather than reviewing alerts in the portal. From the deployment side, relatively straightforward. I mean, IT teams that are used to deploying software will be more than familiar with what's required here. So on the Windows side, you can deploy it through Group Policy, Active Directory, SCCM, Azure AD, Intune. It's a fairly straightforward installation. On Chrome, it's a Chrome extension, so very, very easy to push out. On iPad devices, it's a replacement browser that can be deployed through the Apple Store, where everything inside that browser is monitored. It's pretty much all we can do on Apple devices. And then you've also got a Mac client, which again can be deployed through an MDM. But it's minimum IT burden, really. IT's responsibility is just to make sure the software's on the devices and that it's able to communicate with our servers. So we do provide a dashboard so they can see that. But really, it's about the DSLs being able to depend on IT to have the software installed, and IT can then obviously depend on the DSLs to intervene and deal with those things.
From a map perspective as well, in terms of, because I know the UK Safer Internet Centre have touched on how you should be able to effectively manage these kind of monitoring solutions. It can be multi-tenanted as well. So you can obviously give the local DSL. So if you're a DSL at an individual school, you will only see the alerts being raised for the students under your care. If you are the trust safeguarding lead, then you can have visibility across all tenants. And also we can set the system up so that heads of year can be notified as well. So it's not a case of just individuals receiving every single alert. They can be shared evenly amongst the staff in school, again, to ensure that you're not missing any children that may be at risk. So again, allowing you to effectively manage the monitoring side of things, that multi-tenancy is really important.
Okay, so just one last poll, and then we'll get into the questions. So if you want to take this poll, Matt?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, if you want to give the if this is an area of interest, I suppose, I guess it's always interesting to see or hear people's views on monitoring. Happy to answer the Q&A at the end as well. So just give you a couple of minutes to answer here. If anyone is interested, then yeah, we can reach out over the next kind of week or two. If you want to schedule a session with our pre-sales team, we can talk about the deployment in a little bit more detail, and also show you the interface as well, see the portal. Again, usually monitoring is managed by the safeguarding leads, but ultimately, initially it's the IT managers who are pushing this out. So if we could get the IT and maybe a safeguarding lead on the call, that would be brilliant. But yeah, thank you very much for completing that poll. Okay. And then we can get through to the questions shortly.
Yes, we've got some some questions already on the slide, but I think if we dive into the ones on the Q&A first, and we can make sure the immediate ones are answered that people are asking. So how do we know that the monitoring and filtering systems are regularly updated in line with DfE requirements, the latest language, contextual concerns, etc.? Yeah, I can only speak to how we do that, and obviously as a we operate all of our monitoring out of the UK, so we're very much aligned with DfE and UK requirements. We have ex-DSLs, safeguarding professionals that work for us doing various different roles. So our finger on the pulse with UK requirements is very, very strong. So yeah, it's something that we're constantly doing, so updating our systems, updating our rules, our definitions based on not only the guidance that comes out from the government and government bodies, but also based on what we see day to day. So yeah, latest language, feedback from customers, the work that we do going out into schools and talking to customers, we're always continually improving those systems. Does it work on roaming devices? So it works on any device that is managed. So by that, I mean, it's a school owned device that the school has control over. So if it's a bring your own device type model where the children have bought their own devices with their parents and then bring them into school, it can work on those, but we don't recommend it because ultimately the school has no control over that device. So they can't force it onto there. They can't stop the student just uninstalling it. That's why it has to be a school managed device, really. But devices that go home, absolutely, it'll continue to work wherever that device is. So, if they're at home and, they're using their home Wi-Fi, it'll still continue to work and monitor what's going on that device. Somebody comments that they've had several conversations about monitoring of school devices at home and the legality of this. What's our view on this? Our view is really that schools that provide devices to students have a responsibility to make sure that they are safe on those devices. So, if you were a parent and you bought a device for your child, the parent will be responsible for making sure that child is safe on that device. But because the school has provided it, that responsibility sits with the school. The legality, I'm not aware of anything that makes it illegal to do that, but clearly the school, as under data protection, the controller would have the responsibility to ensure that they're doing things in a legal way. But many of our schools have devices, obviously throughout COVID, this has exploded, that go home with students that continue to be monitored. So we do our monitoring 24/7, 365. And, we do identify risks during the night. It does happen. A lot of schools will say to us, well, I don't want you calling me at 2 a.m. in the morning because a child has searched for porn. Well, we're not going to call for a search for porn, for example, because it's not an immediate life-threatening situation. But actually, on average, the average kind of school might have 1 or 2 instances per year where we're calling in the middle of the night for an urgent safeguarding concern. So a lot of schools look at that and go, okay, well, I mean, that's okay. I can deal with 1 or 2 a year. Others say, actually, our DSLs finish at 5 p.m. No phone calls after 5 p.m. So again, that's what they instruct us to do. But the amount of things that happen in the night that require a phone call are rare, but when they do happen, they are incredibly serious. So obviously, we want to make sure that when we find something, that it gets to the appropriate people and they can help. So all the sort of thing that we talk about during our deployment process and how we set things up and the various risks around that. Can you differentiate between staff and students for the monitoring and who receives the alerts? Yes, so you can link that into your directory so that we know who's staff, who's students. Then you can set up different alerting for staff and students. One thing I would say is that do check first with staff, because the KICSI, DFE, Safer Internet Centre, give us a legal mandate to monitor students. We can do that. For staff, that has to be some other legal reason why you're monitoring staff. So it might be that you get staff to agree to it. That's fine, but you need to just check with staff before you monitor them that you're actually okay to do that. So that's what we always recommend to schools, is check with your data protection, your governors, that you are okay to monitor staff, and don't just do it, and see what happens, Obviously, Matt, if you see any of these you want to answer, do shout. I know I'm taking over these, but
sure, yeah. Is the next question, who receives the alerts, the MAT or individual schools? So it'll bear in mind that we can obviously multi-tenant the solution. It'll be a combination of both. So again, you might have trust leads who have overarching visibility across all sites. So they have the ability to select each tenant and view the alerts for all of those schools. But on a day-to-day basis, it'll be the individual schools and the individual DSLs that are obviously on site and on hand, ready to intervene, obviously, should they need to. So realistically, the alerts will be fed through to the individual schools, but obviously your SLT at MAT level can also be given that global visibility as well. So you've got both sides, if that makes sense anyway. So is the monitoring chargeable over and above the annual license renewal? Is the monitoring chargeable over and above the annual license renewal? Not entirely sure what you...
I think they mean as well as the filter renewal.
As well as the filtering side of things, got you. So yes, it is an additional cost. It's an additional service. So it's a standalone solution, Smooth will monitor. So it's entirely cloud-based. It's obviously got that human moderation built into it. And as a result of that, it needs to be an additional cost. So yeah, this will be a separate cost to your web filtering renewal. Does your software support multi-platforms? Yes, Rob, as far as I'm aware, that's right, isn't it?
Yeah, so we spoke about Windows, Chrome, iOS, and Macs. Yeah.
Perfect.
How long does it take to deploy mat-wide? The technical side of deployment can be very, very quick. You're literally just deploying the client to the machines, and then, as long as they take to install that and reboot. So even with Chrome, Chrome deployment can take a couple of minutes, in some cases. I think that the bit of deployment that maybe takes a little bit longer is thinking about your contacts and how that wants to be set up. So for each school, who's going to be contacted for alerts? Do we want this different for different groups? Do you have like a secondary contact? What's their mobile number? Things like that. So that's where our team will work with you to, build that picture. We'll create a spreadsheet or whatever for that deployment, so we can then identify for each individual school who the contacts are, how they're to be notified. But yeah, the IT side of deployment, very quick. It's just the getting that set up, and then any training that might need to take place. So we can obviously set up Zoom sessions to train your DSLs on how to access the portal, how to review what's in there. It's very, very simple though. Obviously, if you want to take a look at that, we can set up a demo.
In my experience, the thing that takes longest is trying to coordinate everybody and get all of the DSLs together on one call. Obviously, tend to be incredibly busy people. But yeah, as part of the actual license cost, we do include training. And if we have to set up multiple training sessions, appreciate, there might be a number of schools involved. And again, that's something that we can absolutely do. But given that it's usually just a case of pushing out an MSI file via group policy, the IT side of things is very, very quick. So yeah, it tends to be something that we can roll out within a week or two, really, and hopefully get everyone trained up inside that 2-week period as well.
Right. There's a question about, can it be used for potentially finding devices that have been lost or stolen? Not really. I mean, there are ways that you can do that using things like GPS location tracking on devices. We've chosen at the moment not to do that because you then start associating safeguarding incidents with GPS location. It gets a little bit hairy from a data protection perspective. So we tend to leave that kind of functionality to more like mobile device management. So if you're using Chromebooks, then the Google console can be used for doing that kind of thing, or Windows devices, things like Intune and Jamf and other MDMs. So it's not something that we're totally ruling out at the moment, but it's something that we've kind of not looked at yet. So it's more safeguarding focused than it is looking at, IT functions like lost devices, stolen devices, things like that. There's a question: do you alert us if the system is not working? Students managed to stop kill the service on the device. Sort of, we did have that in there. So you've got your dashboard as from the IT perspective that shows you all of your devices and which haven't communicated recently. We don't actually send out an alert when we haven't heard from a device, because the feedback was that schools will, refresh their devices every summer, or they'll, reinstall Windows on all the devices and change their host names every summer. And that then caused loads of alerts to be fired out because we weren't hearing from a device anymore when it just changed names. So actually what we've got is the ability to see all the devices. You can purge devices that are no longer there, but it will highlight to you the devices that we haven't seen for a number of days and things like that. But it's something that, I'd love to look at again and see, if there's anything we can do better there. And there's another question: do you guarantee that you'll capture every incident? And they're curious how much manpower will be required for all the moderation. Yeah, I mean, we obviously do everything we can to capture everything that happens on that device. So, because we operate at the keystroke level, that gives us fairly low level access to capture every interaction between the student and that device. In terms of them reviewing them, we use a combination of our the cloud system implements millions of different rules to analyze what's been typed and whether or not it needs to be moderated. So it's really about the efficiency of that, and being able to analyze all those things and send to the moderators the things that are potentially of concern, and then the moderators will decide what then goes through to the school. But typically our moderators are marking 99% of what we review as false positives. So they are misspellings, they're things that they've looked at the context and it's just not relevant, and things like that. So it's a combination of, there's significant human manpower behind it, but it's a combination of that and the technology working together. And the last question was: we have Smoothall filtering set up across our schools. Is the filtering included within this package, or is there an extra cost?
So again, there's an extra cost associated with this on top of the Smoothall filtering. So we typically base the pricing on a pupil count. So if you can give us an indicative pupil count, then we can share the costs involved with the human moderated service. So it's an additional fee.
And the last one: are there any problems with the software triggering antivirus? No, I mean, we've not come across any particular issues there. We obviously work quite closely with the lots of schools across the country that use different antiviruses, and I think once we had to put that in as an exclusion in there, but there's none currently that we know of that needs that to be there, which I don't know what we're doing that the antiviruses think are okay, but no problems that we're aware of. But obviously, as part of that deployment process, we'd look at that and make sure that we're capturing information correctly and that there are no alerts that are being missed because of antivirus stopping it or anything like that. And I think of the questions on the slide, the only other ones we haven't covered are: how are Matt's budgeting for this? That's something that you can talk about, Matt?
Yes, so it varies from school to school, trust to trust, in terms of whether this comes out of IT budgets or usually safeguarding will have a budget for this on a per school basis. I know Mark's just asked what is the cost per student. So just bear in mind that we have different user bandings depending on the size of your school or trust. So the higher the pupil number, the lower the per license cost. Again, that kind of falls in line with that aggregated pricing model that I mentioned earlier. So the cost per student will vary depending on the size of your school or trust. So once we have an understanding of the number of students, we can then give you an indicative cost. It's difficult to give you a static fee because it does vary. But yeah, it depends, I guess, on the trust itself, whether this would typically come out of the safeguarding budget or IT or a combination of the two. I appreciate, although it's an IT system, it is ultimately a safeguarding tool that the DSLs will be using on a day-to-day basis. And given that the UK Safer Internet Centre, Ofsted, Kixie are now all referring to monitoring, really it is something that obviously all schools and trusts should be looking at in terms of having something in place that is able to identify these risks and these online behaviours, not purely what's happening from a web filtering perspective, because there's a number of platforms and applications now that schools use that wouldn't be picked up by a web filter. So yeah, I guess it's a combination of IT and safeguarding really, but that'll vary depending on your trust. So yeah, any more questions? Appreciate we've just come up to 11 a.m. as well. I suppose if you do have any other questions at all, you can feel free to reach out to the inquiries@smoothwall.com email, or you can email myself. So it would just be matthew.potts@smoothwall.com, or Rob, again, first name dot surname @smoothwall.com tends to be accurate. But yeah, feel free to fire any questions along to the inquiries email, and we can happily pick those up and help you. So yeah, any costings that you require, if you can. I'm just trying to think what the best way of doing it would be. Again, if you want to leave your email in the chat, or again, drop us an email at inquiries@smoothwall.com. We're more than happy to send over some indicative costings via email. That would be no problem.
Yeah. And obviously happy to do a demo or whatever.
Absolutely, yeah.
More information, yeah. Lovely, right, well, thank you very much. I hope you all enjoy the rest of your day. And yeah, really great speaking to you this morning.
Thanks for your time, everyone. Really appreciate it. Take care now.